Hello, I'm Karen Parry, manager of the library's Just for the Health of It initiative. Today you're going to see a program by Dr. Bruno Fang, oncologist at Regional Cancer Care Associates, on what's new in lung cancer. I hope you'll find it very informative.
Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to the cancer support community for supporting education to the community. I also want to thank the East Brunswick Library for having these great programs that we've been part of for a few years. So last year I talked about, we had a similar talk here, and I talked about immunotherapy, and I crafted this talk based on my experience with what people were interested in talking about. So I'm going to talk about a lot of things that are not necessarily new, but are questions that I have a lot from patients and others involved in the care of patients or who know people with lung cancer. And I'll be talking again about what's new in lung cancer, which is obviously the title of the talk. So the talk is going to last hopefully for about 1 hour, and we'll take questions at the end. There you go. So I'll start by talking about the scope of the problem today. Lung cancer, you'll see, continues to be the biggest killer of all cancers. We are still seeing the effects of cigarette smoking for the last 50 years, and we'll go over there. We'll talk about lung cancer in never smokers. It's a big question that we hear. I never smoked. Why do I have cancer? What's going on? We're going to talk about screening for lung cancer. This is one of the relatively new developments in the field. We're going to talk about, again, another question that we hear a lot in terms of genetics and lung cancer. I have a family member with lung cancer. What should I do? We're going to talk about treatment, what's new in surgery, radiation, and then, of course, medical oncology. That's where I think most of the progress has been over the last 10 years, and I call it the dawn of the new era. So lung cancer, still the leading cancer killer in both men and women in the United States. In 1987, it surpassed breast cancer to become the leading cause of death. 158,000 Americans expected to die from lung cancer in 2016, 27% of all cancers. And the number of deaths from lung cancer, the good news is it peaked in 2005, and it's decreasing, but very slowly, only 2.3% in 9 years. 158,000 deaths. 224,000 new cases of lung cancer expected to be diagnosed. The numbers are not out yet. 13% of all cancer diagnosed. So you can see there, 13% of cancer diagnosis, 27% of cancer deaths. Lung cancer is disproportionate in terms of the mortality compared to other cancers. The majority of living lung cancer patients have been diagnosed within the last 5 years. It's mostly a disease of the elderly. 83% of those living with lung cancer were 60 years of older. So that too. I'm coordinating here. So in terms of the United States, Kentucky had the highest age-adjusted lung cancer incidence rates in both women and men, and Utah had the lowest age-adjusted cancer incidence for both men and women. And you see a big difference. From men, we have from 30 to 113 per 100,000. And it completely tracked the smoking patterns. Kentucky has the highest percentage of smoking, which is 30%. Utah, because of its large Mormon community, has the lowest. They're not supposed to smoke, by the way. So, also the most common cancer worldwide. The cancer care cost is $147 billion for all cancers, $13 billion for lung, and if you count the lost productivity due to early death, that will add $134 to the total and $36 billion to lung. More men are diagnosed with lung cancer each year, but more women will live with the disease. The survival is better for women. Men develop lung cancer more often than women. The rate of new lung cancer cases over the past 39 years have dropped 32% for men, but it has almost doubled for women. Again, tracking the smoking habits of men and women over this period of time. Men have cut down as a whole, while women increase smoking over that period. So black men, that's MEN, and women are more likely to develop and die from lung cancer than persons from any other racial or ethnic group. And interestingly enough, that does not track their cigarette smoking habits. Black women have as much cancer as white women, even though they smoke fewer cigarettes as a group. And the same thing for men. When you compare the survival rate for lung cancer, you see how striking the difference is. You hear a lot about prostate cancer, advocacy group, in the news, survivors. But again, the impact of lung cancer in terms of the sheer absolute numbers of new diagnoses, but even more, the impact in terms of the survival is tremendous. You can see the difference, 18% 5-year survival rate for all lung cancers, compared to 64% for colon, 90% for breast, and 99% for prostate. Part of the difference obviously has to do with the survivor community of lung cancer, but also the stigma of cigarette smoking and lung cancer. When lung cancer is caught early, the survival rate is better. But again, a significant percentage of patients will be diagnosed at a later stage. Only 16% of patients are diagnosed at an early stage. For patients who have metastatic disease or disease that has spread to other organs, that survival is 4%. More than half of people with lung cancer die within 1 year of being diagnosed. So a huge problem. Types of lung cancer. We have two major types: non-small cell lung cancer and small cell lung cancer. Non-small cell lung cancer is about 80% to 85% of all lung cancers. Small cell lung cancer, about 15%. There are several different types of non-small cell lung cancer, the most common being adenocarcinoma, which surpassed squamous cell carcinoma a few decades back. Adenocarcinoma is the most common type also of cancer seen in non-smokers. Squamous cell cancer, the shift seems to have come with the low tar cigarettes and the filters in terms of the size of the particles, in terms of how deep they go into the lung. Squamous cell cancer is a cancer of the airway, while adenocarcinoma is a cancer of the end of the airway or the glands. So the idea is that the toxics are going deeper now and they're smaller. Squamous cell cancer is the second most common, heavy smokers, and everything else is rare of the non-small cell lung cancers. Small cell lung cancer, also a cancer of very heavy smokers. It's typical in the way that it spreads early. Even when you have a small cancer, there's a high risk of the cancer having spread to other organs. But also it's typical of for its response to chemotherapy and radiation therapy, at least in the short term. Smoking. Smoking contributes to the vast majority still of lung cancers. We again pay more attention to young people with cancer and to non-smokers with cancer, but still the biggest impact is on actually ex-smokers today. The population of ex-smokers is much bigger than the population of active smokers right now. It's bigger. And also in terms of the years smoked. So right now, ex-smokers as a group have more lung cancer than present smokers, even though the likelihood of cancer decreases dramatically once you quit smoking. Significantly, I should say. And again, you can see the impact here. Men that smoke are 23 times more likely to develop lung cancer. Women that smoke 13 times more likely compared to never smokers. And again, secondhand smoking, the estimate is 20 to 30% greater chance of cancer. But again, we're talking about 20 to 30%, so it's 1.3 times higher risk of lung cancer as opposed to 23 or 13 times. So it's very small, it's present, especially if you're not the one smoking. It's significant, but nothing compared with the huge increase in risk if you're a smoker. So we've gone a long way from this. I love this, the change, how things changed from these times where physicians advertised cigarettes. I love all these ones. I mean, here science was providing support for smoking, and multiple studies and research quoted to support how this is smooth for you and good for you. You have even babies supporting lung cancer. Born gentle. Again, doctors, and my favorite, this one I had not seen before I prepared this talk. When tempted to overindulge, reach for a lucky instead. Otherwise, look at you in 5 years. Is that great? So we went from this to this. So this is, times have changed, thank goodness. So again, we cannot minimize the impact of smoking and the impact that the cigarette industry has had in the health of the country and the world, and the cost in terms of lives lost and money. And they continue to have the same behavior in other countries at this point. Unfortunately, fortunately not here. Never smokers, that's a big, that's an interesting story. So what are never smokers? So the word is, instead of non-smokers, it is never smokers. So people say, I smoked 10 cigarettes when I was in college. So somebody came up with a definition of less than 10 cigarettes for the purpose of doing research on never smokers. 20% of men and 50% of women around the world that have lung cancer. And the big difference here is in Asia. There is a bigger population in Asia of non-smokers with lung cancer. The feeling that we have from the trenches is that the incidence is increasing. However, the studies have been conflicting in terms of if there is a growth or not. And again, you see the big difference, as I mentioned, in terms of the ethnic background. 46% of lung cancers in Asian Pacific Islanders, and only 10% in whites. And they tend to occur at a younger age. This is the interesting part. So this is a gene expression array. And what you have here is the N is just a number. S is smokers, and NS is non-smokers. Each of the colors, the reds represent genes that are turned off. And in blue are the genes that are turned on. And what you see here is that the non-smoker tumors, each line here, each vertical line is a tumor, and the gene expression pattern in the tumor. So this tumor here, this line, has these genes turned on, those genes turned off. And the same thing here. And you can see that on the smokers, you have a pattern here of genes turned on and genes turned off. And you have the opposite, or a different pattern, in the non-smokers, telling us that the biology of these cancers is very different. So these are essentially different diseases. And we know now, we have found many subgroups of patients with where they have molecular markers, which will be much more common in smokers or non-smokers. So these are different diseases, even though they're both cancers occurring in the lung. And we'll find out as we go. We already know, but as we move to the future, that as we individualize treatment, we are going to find that the treatment for both will be different. They won't be guided by smoker or non-smoker, but again, we're going to find more or less of certain mutations that will guide the treatment in one or the other. So one example is that I'll show a little later is, for example, the mutation in the EGFR gene. So that's a gene that's probably the most common mutation that we see that is what we call a targetable mutation for which we have a drug. It's much more common in Asians. It's more common in non-smokers. And it's not common in smokers. Conversely, immunotherapy will work better in smokers. And the reason for that is that the smokers' cancers are much dirtier in terms of the mutations. So when you're using immunotherapy, you're allowing the immune system to attack proteins that are foreign to the body. So as a cancer develops, it will develop abnormal proteins, and these abnormal proteins will be targets for the immune system. And the immunotherapy will, as I will show a little later, will expand on that attack on the cancer. The lung cancers that are related to smoking have years of mutations that accumulated from all the carcinogens of the cigarette, as opposed to the non-smoker, where you're going to find many times they're cleaner, they have much less mutations. They have one, for example, mutation, one single mutation that is driving the cancer, as opposed to 30, which you will see on the other tumor. So cigarette smoking will not determine how we're going to treat the patient, but we see that we'll find some types of cancer more in the smokers than in not, and vice versa. So what could be causes of lung cancer in non-smokers? Well, we know that there is an increasing risk associated with secondhand smoking. There is clear data showing that radon causes cancer in miners, especially uranium miners. This is data from the 1800s in mines in Germany. They had these huge clusters. Everybody would die in the mines of lung cancer. Now, I'll go back a little bit on this. We'll talk about radon a little bit. So what is radon? Radon is a tasteless, colorless, and odorless gas produced by decaying uranium, and it occurs naturally in soil and rock. So as I mentioned, the association with miners is clear. The association with home exposure is believed to exist, but the size of the risk is unclear. One estimate stated that 20,000 of these lung cancers, of these 240,000 in the United States, are likely related to radon. A study in Europe estimated 2% of the lung cancers there were related to radon. But again, the studies are unclear, and the amount of radon that you would need to develop cancer is unclear. Now, I thought this was interesting. This is a map of the United States. Yellow is less, red is most, and orange is in the middle in terms of radon distribution in the United States. And more interestingly, this is New Jersey. But again, even at the higher level, it's not 100% established. Again, radon is everywhere. The risk is felt to be in basements, obviously closer to the ground, but basements mostly because the windows are usually closed, so the air just stays there and it doesn't go and it doesn't float around. But again, it's the amount of risk associated with the radon is not clear. But I like being orange rather than red. So other things, air pollution. The thought is it must cause some degree of cancer, especially in cities like Beijing or Mumbai, where you have an incredible amount of pollution. The idea is similar to cigarette smoking, but again, it's been very hard to prove. Because again, in third world countries, again, the amount of cigarette smoking is much more than what you see here. Asbestos, it multiplies the risk of cigarette smoking, and to some degree, it also causes lung cancer in non-smokers. Chronic lung disease, so we see cases of, for example, tuberculosis, scars in tuberculosis, you develop cancer there. So some idea is that if you have some chronic irritation of your lung, you potentially could develop lung cancer. so there's some data supporting that. HPV, so the virus that causes cervical cancer, esophageal cancer, there's some data suggesting that it could be related to some non-smoking lung cancers, but again, other studies have not supported that. And genetics. So we'll talk a little bit more about genetics. So this is a big question, and the answer is that yes, there is some degree of influence on your genes in terms of lung cancer. It's not well understood. There is one gene which is, again, the same EGFR gene that I mentioned before. They recently, a couple of years ago, researchers have found that there are small clusters of families with increased risk of lung cancer in non-smokers. And they have this mutation, the T79M mutation, in their germline, meaning they're born with a mutation, they're passing this mutation to their children. And that increases the risk of lung cancer. But this is only a small minority of patients. This is something rare. We know that first-degree relatives of individuals with lung cancer have an increased risk of developing lung cancer, even adjusting for age, gender, and smoking habits. So a large study showed that there was a large meta-analysis, which is a study that looked at 28 studies, showed that there was an 80% increased risk of lung cancer in first-degree relatives of lung cancer patients. Again, being a smoker increases your risk by 23%, which is not 23%, 23 times. This is a 1.8 time. The risk is greatest in patients diagnosed at young age, and in those with multiple family members. So again, 50 to 90%, I mentioned this number. The more relatives you have, the higher risk. Again, nothing compared to cigarette smoking, but definitely some increased risk. Other cancers in the family, if you have breast cancer, ovarian cancer, that doesn't count in terms of lung cancer, this higher risk. And smokers who develop lung cancer are less likely to have a family history than non-smokers that develop lung cancer. Having said that, if you have a family history of lung cancer, you're going to multiply that 1.8 risk by 23, not necessarily, but you're going to potentiate that, and you're going to increase even further your risk of lung cancer. There are two studies going on right now, one in University of Cincinnati and one at LSU in New Orleans, where they are trying to figure out the genetics of lung cancer. So the first one is for people who have one relative diagnosed with lung cancer, and the second one, if you have lung cancer or have two or more relatives diagnosed with lung cancer. So you don't need to be from Cincinnati or New Orleans, and there's no cost to participate. So I think these are interesting studies. There are such studies for most cancers today when you have families in different places. And here there are two, and if you want to, that's the reference. So moving it to the treatment part. So how do we diagnose lung cancer? How do we find lung cancer in the first place? We're going to talk about how do we define what treatment we're to do, how to figure out what stage the cancer is, and then what are the treatments for different stages of lung cancer. So one way to find lung cancer is screening. So studies have shown, very large studies with tens of thousands of patients, have shown that screening patients with what we call low-dose CAT scan can decrease the lung cancer mortality by 20%. Compared to chest X-ray, which has been shown not to work in multiple prior studies. The low-dose CAT scan uses a fraction of the dose of a regular CAT scan to decrease the risk of exposure to radiation because now you're talking about thousands of people that you're going to be giving radiation. At least 8.6 million Americans qualify, and I'll mention in the next slide what the qualification is as a high risk for lung cancer. And if half of these 8.6 million people were screened, over 13,000 lung cancer deaths could have been prevented. So all of them, 26,000. So to be a candidate for screen, and basically these were the criteria for you to be in the study. People aged 55 to 80 with a smoking history of 30 pack a year. And that basically means 1 pack per day for 30 years, half a pack a day for double that, 2 packs a day for 15 years, etc. You just multiply the years by the number of packs. And then the study looked at yearly low-dose CAT scan for 3 years. So one way of finding lung cancer, and again, the idea here is that screening would be on that percentage where the lung cancer is found early and therefore is much more curable. This is a picture of a screening CAT scan, and you can see the tiny dot there. This is found very early. And we all, or many of us, will have tiny dots in our lungs. So the radiologists that participate in screening programs have developed criteria to define these dots as high risk, low risk by size and by appearance. And depending on the size, the appearance of this, they recommend referral to a surgeon. They follow up in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, because that's going to tell us if this is growing or not. Because one of the downsides of screening is that then you're going to be operating in a lot of people who didn't need surgery in the first place. So you have to be, the idea here is that if you were going to be screened, you want to be screened at a center that has expertise in that. Both Robert Wood and St. Peter's have screening centers where you have surgeons, radiologists all working together to assess these CAT scans. So screening is one way. The other one is incidental finding. And we see a lot of patients that had an X-ray or a CAT scan for a different reason, and they turned out to have something in the lung. Patients that have pneumonia, or patients I just saw last week somebody who had a vascular study to look at the aorta and they found something in the lung. We had MRIs of the spine. So we sometimes will find things in that way. Symptoms usually are going to be markers of more advanced disease. By the time you develop symptoms, the disease is likely to be more advanced. Cough, shortness of breath, coughing up blood, chest pain, swelling in the face and arms from blockage of the veins in the chest, hoarseness from damage to the nerve of the vocal cord, symptoms related to spread of cancer such as headaches, seizures, and symptoms related to what we call paraneoplastic syndromes. These are paraneoplastic syndromes are scenarios where the cancer will produce usually hormones that will cause high calcium, low sodium that in itself, on themselves will cause symptoms. So once we find the cancer, so if a chest X-ray shows something, you need a CAT scan with contrast. The CAT scan, the idea of the CAT scan is to show it will show the tumor, and it will show if there is any lymph nodes in the middle of the chest. So the cancer here, these are the lungs. I'm sorry, this is a CAT scan. This is a slice of a body. So what we're seeing here is a person lying down. This is the spine. That's the chest, right lung, left lung, and we have a tumor here. These are all blood vessels within the lung. This is the aorta, and this is what we call the mediastinum, which is the middle of the chest. So when you see something like this, you're interested to see, obviously, where in the lung, but also we're looking to see if the lymph nodes are involved. You'll have what we call hilar lymph nodes, which is station number 1, which will make it this will be a stage 1 in general if you have only the tumor up to a certain size. Stage 2 if it goes to the lymph nodes in the hilum, which is where the lung connects to the chest. Stage 3 if it's in the mediastinum, which is the middle of the chest. And stage 4 if it goes to other organs. So you got a CAT scan to plan for the surgery or to figure out, depending on the lymph nodes, if the patient is a surgical candidate. Once you find that, before you go to surgery, you should have a PET scan. PET scan this is a PET CT scan, sorry. So a PET CT, it's two tests actually. It's a PET scan. The PET scan is a functional study. The PET scan is basically a test where you're injected this radioactive sugar that will be retained in cancer, but also can be retained in areas of inflammation. So if you see a hot area on the PET scan, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's cancer. But the idea here is if you find an area that is suspicious for cancer, what you're trying to see with the PET scan is not necessarily the tumor itself, because that you can see, but you want to see small lymph nodes if they're lighting up, because that's going to, again, help you on your plan as to whether surgery is an option or you need to do something else. Also, the PET scan will show the whole body. It will show you if there is cancer spread to other organs. So the idea here is the CAT scan, and the CAT scan, when we say PET CT scan, the PET scan is just a blur. What you have on the PET scan is a blur of hot and cold. And the CAT scan, the CT part of it, is just a map. So it came out dark here, but what you see here, the spine, the ribs, this is the CAT scan, and they overlay the PET scan, which is again a heat map on top of the CAT scan, so you can see the anatomy. So you can see where is hot. Because if you just see the PET scan, you just see blurs. You don't know what it is. So the computer will overlay the CAT scan on a PET scan, and then you can see if a lymph node here is hot or not. The one part of the body that the PET scan doesn't show is the brain. So for many lung cancers, before you go for surgery, you want to make sure that there is no spread anywhere else. So patients will have a brain scan performed before surgery to make sure that there's nothing spread anywhere else. So this is the basic radiology that we'll get. In the past, we would get bone scans, and CAT scans of the whole body. But now with PET scans that eliminate that will find both bone and cancer in other areas except for the brain, and then we have a brain MRI or brain scan. So the next step is a biopsy. In some situations, we don't do a biopsy when if you see just that small spot in the lung, which is hot on PET scan. The issue is that if the biopsy comes back negative, that you still don't know what that is. A biopsy is putting a needle into that lump, and if you if you have cancer, you know you got it. If you don't have cancer, you don't know if you missed it. And that's why a negative biopsy is not helpful. So many times you will see, especially with smaller lesions, where it's clear that there's nothing anywhere else, a surgeon will recommend just go and take it out. Because even if I biopsy and it comes back negative, I'm still not comfortable that this is not cancer. There are situations where we're going to find something small or something that looks inflammatory. They may look like a cancer, where we're going to say, let's repeat this CAT scan in 3 months, because we don't know if it's cancer. And if we do a biopsy, if it comes back negative, I can't be sure. So time will tell us. If that thing disappears or it doesn't grow, we'll continue to watch it. But in most situations, we will do a biopsy. So this is and again, I got this picture because this is inside of a needle. This is what you get with a needle. This is a core biopsy. So all this tissue, you can see the needle. This came out from the inside of the needle. So this is how much you can get with a core biopsy. So there's a core biopsy, you put a big needle in there, and you take the whole chunk of tumor. And there is also an FNA where you just aspirate cells, and they will be just cells spread in a fashion like this. The advantage of the core biopsy is, in this day and age where I'm going to show we need to get all kinds of markers, mutations, etc., we may run out of tissue very fast with just a few cells there. So how do we get a biopsy? So this is one of the old ways, bronchoscopy. You have someone with a camera, like a colonoscopy, an endoscopy. Basically, you go into the lung and you look and you take a piece of tissue. Now, the bronchoscopy will work if the tumor is located centrally in one of these areas here, because there's so far that the bronchoscopy can go. So if the tumor is located on the outside here, then the airways are too small. You cannot get there with the bronchoscopy. Now on what's new. So this is new. This is available at St. Peter's, and I think by Robert too. So this is a cool concept, and this is a type of bronchoscopy that can go into much smaller airways. So basically, instead of looking at the airway here, what you do is you get a CAT scan of the patient, a high-resolution CAT scan, a very detailed CAT scan, and you input into the system. And then you'll have these electrodes where you're going to have a 3D GPS location of the tip of that bronchoscope. And you can guide it. And here are the several images. It didn't come out very well. But you can guide it through the airway. You make a plan before you go, and then you can guide it through the airway, looking at your map based on the GPS location of that bronchoscope. And you can go much farther out than you could with a regular bronchoscope to get a biopsy. And again, this is, I got the view. So again, you have here your map. So the computer is telling you where to go and pointing you based on the plan that you made prior on how you're going to get through the airway. So as opposed to you looking, you basically have a much thinner probe that the computer will help you guide through the airway. And here you can see this is much farther out that you would be able to do. The advantage here is that you're not going to do this, which is a CT-guided biopsy. So, as I mentioned, when the cancers are close to the airway, you can do a bronchoscopy. If they're farther out, the airways are too small. So the best way to get it is with a needle. This one, I mean, you can see the needle here. This is quite dramatic, but this is probably the most common way today of getting biopsies because, as I said, most of our cancers are adenocarcinomas, and they're going to be on the outside, far away. There is a risk of dropping a lung with this procedure of a pneumothorax. The more emphysema someone has, the higher the risk. And sometimes, again, we don't even do biopsy. Sometimes we just cannot do biopsy because if somebody's lung function is too bad, then dropping that lung could lead someone to complete respiratory failure. So a biopsy will be too risky, and that's where that navigational biopsy may be indicated. Because again, you're not going through the whole lung with a needle. So that's how we get tissue to plan for treatment. Sometimes we cannot get tissue and we go in for surgery. We do not like to do radiation or chemotherapy without a piece of tissue. So if there are situations where surgery is not planned, then we absolutely need tissue because we cannot know for sure what we're treating. So what's new in surgery? Not a lot. So the VATS, which is the video-assisted thoracoscopic surgery, which is now very disseminated. Again, the idea here is the same thing with laparoscopy. They use cameras, smaller incisions, faster recovery, less pain. So on the right side, you have the open thoracotomy, the old way. You spread the ribs, the recovery is long. That's a big surgery, a lot of pain. The VATS procedure, again, faster recovery. Still, patients may have post-operative nerve pain because, again, there's not a lot of spacing between the ribs and all the nerves here run under the ribs. But again, less than what we would see with the old procedure. This is a picture of a VATS procedure. Again, camera, instruments, and the RATS. I love the name. That's robotic-assisted thoracoscopic surgery. So this is the robot with all the plastic, just because it's sterile plastic in the OR covering it. You can barely see the robot behind it. Each one of these is one of the instruments going to the chest. The patient is there. That's not that popular because, again, the chest is easy enough for surgeons to operate on as opposed to the prostate, where it's a very small space. And robots are helpful because then you're talking about big movements which you do with a robot will transfer in. They're not truly robots, actually. They're not doing anything by themselves, but basically what you're doing with your hands, the movement is much, it happens at a smaller rate. So you don't have to be shaking like this when you're doing something small. If you do this, the robot will do the same movement, but in a much smaller scale. So rats are not that popular. Let's talk about radiation. So the standard of care today is and this is modern chemotherapy, radiation, is for radiation that will combine, would use imaging to define the field of tumor to be treated. The old radiation therapy, basically you will go from one side and you will do x-rays or even CAT scans, and then they'll make a plan, and that will just be an approximation. You radiate a lot of normal tissue. The idea here is that if you can minimize the amount of radiation to healthy tissue, you're going to minimize side effects and potentially can increase the amount of radiation to the cancer. Having said that, the maximum radiation has been accomplished for these modalities and has not been beneficial compared to the standard. So we have reached a point where more radiation with these modalities has not been helpful. So IMRT, it's image guided, and the intensity of the radiation is modulated. Conformal 3D radiation, again, they use a CAT scan to guide it. The same thing with tomotherapy. They use imaging. Now, stereotactic body radiation. So stereotactic body radiation, again, one example of stereotactic body radiation is the CyberKnife. That's a brand of a machine that does that. And the idea here is that you will have, again, very complex softwares and a machine that has an incredible mobility. And you are going to, the slide didn't come very well, so very good. So let me go back to this slide here. The idea here is that the more angles you use to treat a tumor, the less radiation in each path of your radiation you're going to get. If you use the old radiation would use only 2 angles. So through the whole path of the radiation of the first beam would get half of the whole radiation that the tumor got, and the other path will get the other half. Here, if you have 100 angles, each path gets 1% of the total amount of the tumor. And again, this picture didn't come out too good. But you can see here, this is planning for the CyberKnife. And each line here is a path that the radiation machine is giving to that tumor. And this is a map, the heat map here, of how much radiation each area is getting. So this is the tumor, and that's how they design. This is the hottest area. They need to give a margin for cells that they don't see, and then smaller areas around it. So how do we use stereotactic radiation? CyberKnife. So studies, especially from Asia, Japan, have that's where they started. For patients who have small tumors, who are not candidate for surgery, because again, for patients who today, the regular patients who get radiation are patients who are not surgical candidates. And they are not surgical candidates, and I'm going to show a little later, because they already have lymph node involvement to a degree that surgery could not clean everything. So the regular radiation has a big field to get. You have to get the tumor, plus you have to get all the lymph nodes. And the CyberKnife will give a lot of radiation to a small spot. Same thing for stereotactic radiation. That doesn't work when you're dealing with a large area. However, if you have small tumors, that would work. So the standard today is still to do surgery to remove small tumors. But in patients who are too sick, for example, their lung function would not allow surgery, or they cannot go off their Plavix because they just got a stent, or they are too high risk to have surgery, and they have a small tumor. The rate of control of cancer with these modalities is excellent. For patients well selected, this is very useful, and I'll answer questions at the end, and it will save patients from having surgery. But again, it's for a very clear, very limited indication here. Another modality is the proton therapy. So the concept of proton is very interesting. The idea here is that when you're doing photon radiation, which is regular radiation, the radiation goes across. Again, you have a path and the radiation will go across your body. So you're going to get radiation in and you get radiation out. Protons, as you may remember from physics, are the fat parts of the atoms. And the neat idea here is that you can control the depth where the proton will stop. The photon just goes across. You can't stop it. The proton, they calculate the proton, where does it go and where it stops. And therefore, you can limit the amount of radiation to healthy areas and potentially increase the amount of radiation to the tumor. So the concept is incredibly interesting, and it's been incredibly useful in situations where you have very sensitive organs around the tumor. So a classic and very well-established indication for proton therapy is for children with brain tumors. Because again, if you radiate that whole brain, you're going to have serious trouble as the child develops. So when you have to limit the amount very narrowly of the radiation that you're giving around. Now, for lung cancer, so this is a drawing again, not a drawing, but a planning of the radiation therapy. So this is conventional radiation, so you can see the heat map again of the beams of radiation going through the chest. The cancer is underneath, it's underneath the word tumor. And this is the proton, how is designed, where it doesn't go. You see the beam here, it stops. So they're still using two beams, but the heart is not getting radiation anymore, where before the heart was getting all this radiation on the side. On this example, the heart is not getting, the heart is being spared. So there are clear indications for proton therapy. But again, lung cancer in general, the studies have not shown a benefit in terms of cure or survival. And the criticism has been that they have not yet pushed the dose. However, other studies with regular radiation have shown that the dose have not helped. But the argument may be that it didn't help because people just got too sick with the high radiations and something else killed them. In prostate cancer, for example, proton has not been shown to be superior on the studies that have been done so far. But proton will have very, very specific indications. For example, a good example is women with breast cancer who have, on the left side, who have to be radiated close to the chest, where you're really trying to design a field that will avoid the heart. And in some patients with lung cancer, where the tumor is close to the heart and you're trying to avoid that. But the vast majority of patients, that's still not an indication. But again, we will hear a lot because they'll advertise a lot, but most of them will not be able to get paid by the insurance company. And one situation where proton is helpful is on patients who need to be re-radiated. So many patients will have a second cancer in a closed area that cannot be operated. And proton will allow us to re-radiate the area, for example, because there's so much you can do to the spinal cord. So you have to, again, narrow the field to decrease the amount of radiation. We do that with head and neck cancers and other cancers. So again, for specific situations, proton is helpful, but again, the cost is still not justified for the vast majority of patients. So I'll talk about my specific area, which is medical oncology. Again, this is the paradigm for us. Again, I'm going to be talking about right now I'm going to be talking about stage 4 disease. So these are patients who either had surgery and radiation and the cancer came back, or patients who were diagnosed and were not a candidate for surgery or radiation. The idea here, as I mentioned, is you get a biopsy. You will send this biopsy to one of several labs that perform analysis on multiple genes, and then you have the result in terms of which gene mutations you have. And if you find one for which you have a drug, you will do targeted therapy, meaning you target a specific mutation on a specific tumor in that specific person. The reason this happened is because we saw in the late 2000s a significant drop in cost in DNA sequencing. So it's incredibly cheap. We went from $10,000 in 2000, and this is a very short amount of time. We're talking about 10 years. You went from $10,000 per megabase, 1,000 bases, for a million bases, to less than 1 cent. So this has been incredible progress, and that's what allowed this revolution in cancer treatment. So mutations. So this is somewhat old slide, 2011, when they first started looking at the mutations that were there. So KRAS is a gene for which we still struggle to find a therapy for. But again, EGFR, as I mentioned, is the most common treatable mutation. EML ALK4, another treatable mutation for which we have a specific drug. So we have now approved four drugs for this mutation, 3 drugs for this mutation, and then for the others, we have either clinical trials or drugs that we use off-label with some response. Of this study, a mutation was found in 54% of patients, but again, 22% of those are KRAS, which we still cannot treat. So, targeted therapy, this is the big breakthrough of the first decade of the 2000s. And again, this field continues to advance. We have more potent drugs for the same mutations. And again, we have the development of new drugs for the mutations for which we still don't have drugs. And again, most of these drugs, if not all of them, are pills this day. Each one's, and most of them cost between $10,000 and $15,000 a month to take. Chemotherapy. Chemotherapy still has a role. Chemotherapy basically, but we have reached a ceiling here. We can't move any further. We have very few chemotherapies being developed or approved lately. What chemotherapy does mostly is interferes with DNA, in most cases DNA replication, and they will interfere with the cell ability of cells to divide, and then it will trigger apoptosis. So cells have mechanisms that if their DNA gets damaged to a significant degree, they will flip a button and they'll get the auto-destruct. So that's how the chemotherapy works. Cancers that do not respond to chemotherapy either have the auto-destruct flip broken, or they are able to get rid of the chemotherapy through pumps, etc. But the most common reason is the ability to self-destruct when they get damaged to a significant degree. Chemotherapy, again, still has a role, especially on patients who do not have the mutations, but even on those who have a mutation, chemotherapy still work at some point in their disease. Now, the targeted therapy was the big development of the first decade of the 2000s, and this is the big development of this decade, 2010 to present. So cancer immunotherapy is something that cancer researchers have been pursuing for forever. And until very recently, we had nothing to show for it. So the first immunotherapy, so we've had drugs that would stimulate the immune system at high cost, such as interferon, interleukin, for some tumors such as melanoma and kidney cancer, which seem to be very sensitive to immunotherapy, but nothing else. Then a drug called ipilimumab, the commercial name is Yervoy, came out for melanoma. And that was a major revolution because this was a invariably deadly disease, metastatic melanoma. And now you had immunotherapy that actually was curing a percentage of patients that had metastatic disease. But that drug was very toxic. Now, the next generation of drugs, which is are the PDL1 or PD-1 inhibitors. So this is a concept that the concept here is cancer cells, as I mentioned before, as they mutate, they will have what they call neoantigens, meaning that they will start having on their surface proteins that are not present in normal cells. These are not your normal cells. These are cancer cells. And again, the idea here is the more mutated your cancer cell, the more abnormal proteins they're going to have, the more likely they are to respond to your immune system. However, scientists figure out that the cancer will make this protein called the PDL1. And the PDL1 will block the immune system from recognizing them as foreign. So we have many drug companies that have, this was licensed to, I think, 8 drug companies to develop antibodies or drugs that would block that block. So they will attack that block, the PDL1, and it will then that will unmask the tumor so that the immune system can see it. It's not a targeted treatment in the sense that you're just telling the immune system, here you go for it. Problem is that this same mechanism also protects the cells, the normal cells in the body against the immune system. So this has been, again, revolutionary in terms of concept, in the sense that this is less toxic than the first generation, the ipilimumab. And it worked not only in melanoma, but it's been approved for lung cancer, bladder cancer, esophageal cancer, head and neck cancer. So in many cancers, we'll have this mechanism. And remember, I mentioned smokers will respond more to this because, again, they have more mutations. So the immune system has a less difficulty finding them. Colon cancer patients, this is not approved for colon cancer, but that's also very interesting. Colon cancer patients, a percentage of them will have a type of will have familial colon cancer, what's called Lynch syndrome. So this is a disease that is characterized by an abnormality or mutations in the genes that are supposed to fix DNA errors. So basically, your DNA you have errors all the time when your cells are dividing, and you have mechanisms to fix it. In this condition, Lynch syndrome, the fixing mechanism is broken. So you will accumulate mutations until you get cancer. Those 15% of patients that either have that syndrome, familial syndrome, or their cancer developing that way, will respond to immunotherapy, as opposed to the other 85% of patients that have regular colon cancers. Again, because they have more mutations, then your immune system will have less trouble finding it. This is incredibly exciting, but it didn't work for lung cancer yet. This has worked for leukemias, and you may have seen a couple of years back at UPenn, they cured kids that had no hope with some types of leukemia. This is, again, the part of this new frontier of immunotherapy, but this is a little bit more involved. The idea here is this is targeted. What I showed in terms of immunotherapy on the last slide was just you're telling the immune system, okay, I'm taking the blinds off, go and attack it if you can. Some patients will have long-term survival, some patients will have very long-term survival, but again, that's not targeted. You basically try, and then again, the side effects of these immunotherapies are that multiple parts of the immune system, multiple parts of the body can be affected. You can have an autoimmune skin disease, pituitary disease, diarrhea, bowel disease, lung disease, etc. This is targeted immunotherapy. The idea here is that you're going to take the immune cells out of your body. You're going then to engineer them to recognize a specific protein in that cancer. And that's why that was easy in the leukemias, because they're very well characterized by very specific abnormal proteins. Then you're going to infuse, you're going to grow those cells, you're going to expand them, and you're going to throw back into the patient. So you're attacking a very, very specific protein that only the cancer cell has. The problem with this was that this was so efficient that it caused what they call a cytokine storm, which is basically the immune system went crazy because, of course, these kids had leukemia cells everywhere. So suddenly the immune system is going after all this stuff, and they were all in the intensive care unit almost dying. So so it hasn't worked for lung cancer because it's not one protein that you have. And again, lung cancer will when you get when you look at the cancer that has spread through the body and you get cancer in different parts, you're going to see different, what you call populations. You're going to see different mutations in different cells. So that's the problem. When you're trying to narrow too much your target, you're going to lose a lot in lung cancer because it's a much dirtier cancer than a leukemia, for example. But this is very exciting for many cancers, and maybe for some group of lung cancer patients that have that cleaner cancer, not the hypermutated cancer. So again, just in general, how do we treat cancer from the diagnosis? You have to stage the cancer. So stage 1, in general, you have the lung tumor. Again, as I showed, there are no lymph nodes involved. You do surgery if you can. If the patient can tolerate surgery, etc. Otherwise, I mentioned the CyberKnife or stereotactic radiation. Stage 2, either a very large tumor or, more commonly, the lymph node, the first station of lymph nodes are involved. Surgery is still what you should do here. Now, in stage 1 lung cancer, there is no clear benefit of doing chemotherapy after surgery. For stage 2 lung cancer, after surgery, there is a clear benefit of doing chemotherapy after surgery to decrease the risk of the cancer coming back. Stage 3, again, the cancers went to the middle of the chest, as I showed on the CAT scan. Treatment can be surgery, followed, as I mentioned, chemotherapy, because stage 2 and stage 3, you do chemotherapy after surgery, and potentially radiation therapy, or radiation and chemotherapy. And it's not clear for stage 3 disease which one is best at this point. Stage 4 cancer has spread to other organs, as I showed before. This is the situation where you check for the molecular markers. So what is that? You look for the mutations for which we have drugs or we have drugs in development. We don't look, we used to send 3 or 4 mutations before. Now we send these things to labs that do 300, 1,000, or now we're using this company that does the whole genome. They look at your whole genome, they look at all your RNA, and they look at 30,000 proteins. Again, this is a little bit of overkill in terms of what we have available. We have limited drugs, but in terms of clinical trials and then later being able to come back and look if a new drug comes for something new, this is going to be very valuable. So if you have one of these mutations, I mentioned the GFR, the ALK4, etc., you're going to get the pill. If you have now more than 50% of that PD-L1 protein, a study that just came out in the last 6 months showed that you will do better if you get chemotherapy, if you get immunotherapy first instead of chemotherapy. Now, if you don't have any of the markers and you don't have the PD-L1, chemotherapy is still the first line of treatment. So a little bit about small cell lung cancer, 15%. So all this stuff that I talked until now, this was non-small cell lung cancer. Now, small cell lung cancer, as I mentioned, the problem is that it spreads early. So it's very rare for us to find a stage 1 tumor that hasn't spread to the lymph nodes. We do find sometimes we go operate, and these patients, we tend to give chemotherapy, which we don't do for a stage 1 non-small cell lung cancer because these patients their cancer tends to spread very fast. Limited disease is disease that it's in the chest that we can treat with radiation therapy. In addition to the chemo, extensive disease, it's spread beyond the chest. Again, this is very sensitive to chemoradiation. The tumor will shrink very fast. Probably it will come back, but a small percentage of patients will be cured with chemotherapy and radiation. The different thing is that this type of cancer, 50% of patients, the cancer will come back in the brain, and doing radiation at the end of chemotherapy has been shown to increase survival and decrease the risk of the cancer coming back in the brain for limited disease and decrease the risk of the cancer coming back in extensive disease. So this is a situation where we do preventatively brain radiation. Experimental treatments for small cell, there's not a lot out there. Immunotherapy has had some minimal success. There are some, again, targets. Aurora kinase inhibitor. This is going further into trials. There seems to be much interesting response to immunotherapy. And these are some other drugs that have shown in early trials to be promising. For non-small cell, I inverted the order for non-small cell. Again, the idea now, most of the trials for non-small cell are combining immunotherapy drugs to try to circumvent ways that the cancer is defending itself against one drug. So to try to stimulate the immune system through many different pathways. We already know that we know from the melanoma experience that the side effects are much greater, but the response also is greater. So for patients who are fit, this may end up by being the way to go. Early studies with combination with that drug that is approved for melanoma and the drug, the PD-L1, have been very promising. Natural killer cells, this is what they call, as opposed to the CAR T cells, is a much less hot storm. So there's research looking into natural killer cells. CAR T cell, again, nothing in lung has worked. And again, targeted agents to the new markers. A little bit about survivorship. We call survivors, usually the definition is cancer survivors are patients with cancer at the end of their, once they finish their treatment, their active treatment, and then for their lifetime. For lung cancer, patients that complete treatment will have CAT scans every 6 months of the chest for 2 years, and then they'll have a low-dose CAT scan. The reason for the CAT scans every 6 months is to look for lymph nodes or local recurrence that you still could come back and cure again. Obviously, if the cancer spreads, that cannot be curable, but that's why we're limiting to the chest, the CAT scans. And the long-term low dose is because, especially in smokers, you're going to see a high risk of second lung cancers that you want to catch. We're going to follow the patients with lung cancer for complications of the treatment. Tiredness is a common complaint for survivors. Shortness of breath, especially if you had radiation that damaged part of your lung, if you had surgery where you have a part of your lung removed. Chemobrain is something that some drugs, especially cisplatin, which is the main drug that we use, there's data that it can affect the cognitive function, depression, and anxiety. We always recommend lifestyle modifications. Activity and exercise is the best treatment for fatigue during and after treatment. A diet rich in fruit and vegetables seems to be good for everything, including lung cancer, or in terms of prevention of lung cancer, even though vitamins turned out to be bad for lung cancer. Disability-wise, this is interesting. Lung cancer has the longest disability among all cancers. 45% only will be returning to work after 2 years. Again, caregivers, as Alan will remind us, it's very important for us to pay attention on the caregivers. That's a huge load on the family members caring for someone with cancer. Smoking cessation is critical. A significant percentage of patients cannot quit smoking despite a diagnosis of cancer. So that's, again, something we have to work on. And again, coordination of care is very important to do during their survivorship. Communicate with a primary care physician and work with everybody involved. And that's the end of my talk. I'm going to take questions. Thank you.
The Asian more for the non-smoking lung cancer, are these the Asian from the Asia or the Asian of US?
It seems to be genetic. It carries too. Here too.
And also the air pollution, so the Asian way of walking, that will be considered part of air pollution.
Of doing what?
Walking.
Oh, walk.
The way they cook.
Good. Yes, walking. Yes, I didn't mention that, but yes, cooking oils and yes, those things could contribute to lung cancer. I didn't mention that.
You mentioned PDL. Is this when you see this ad for Optiva?
Right.
Is that what that means?
That's one of the drugs. Yes, it's one of the drugs that will block that. Yes.
Is it successful, or does it also hurt the body the same as chemotherapy?
So as I mentioned, all these immunotherapy drugs, all drugs have side effects, and the idea here is that it's not a targeted immunotherapy. You're basically, again, releasing the immune system. So it's been successful in lung cancer. The more PD-L1 you have in your tumor, the more successful the treatment is. In terms of side effects, again, fatigue is the main side effect, but again, autoimmune all kinds of things can happen. There are reports of autoimmune fatal hepatitis, which are rare, autoimmune fatal myocarditis, so the heart completely an autoimmune process that attacks the heart, but these are rare. In the big picture, the autoimmune complications are easily treated with steroids.
So in other words, if the patient has a reoccurrence of lung cancer, you look at the patient and say, well, they have PDL, a greater
Right.
amount, let's try it, rather than more chemotherapy.
It depends. As I said, in the first line, yes.
Yeah.
But in the second line, even patients that have no PDL have benefited. So, for example, Devo, their approval is not for a second line treatment is not dependent on how much PDL a tumor has. But for first line, when compared to first line chemotherapy, the percentage was key of more than 50%.
Okay, two questions. One is, once you have, like, say you have an alpha mutation, and then you have other mutations that you said, tumors in your body because it has spread, does that alpha mutation then mutate to those other maybe key mutations, and then before you should get that kind of therapy?
Right. So the question, I'm sorry, I should have been repeating the question. The question was, if you have a tumor that has a driver mutation such as the ALK4, and the cancer continues to mutate and develops a new mutation, can you then treat that mutation? The interesting thing here is the difference between what we call a driver mutation and a passenger mutation. And many times you don't know which one is which. The driver mutation is the mutation that if you block the effect of the mutation, the cancer will stop growing. And then there are all these other mutations that you could block, but they just happen to be because the cancer is mutating. The question will be not, so the driver mutation, and that's something we see with the EGFR. For example, the EGFR the EGFR mutation is the mutation where we have the most experience, or because we've known it for longer. And that's an interesting situation because over the years, scientists figured out that that same mutation that I mentioned before, the T790M mutation that is seen in the DNA of these families that have lung cancer, so that mutation is what they call a secondary mutation. So the majority of patients that have an EGFR mutation that are getting a drug to block it, and the drug stops working, they get a second mutation that blocks the drug. So just last year, we got a new drug that was approved that actually goes around that mutation. So it's not necessarily that you'll get other mutations that you can block a mutation, but sometimes you get mutations that will protect the pathway of that mutation that you have, will allow it to work and will not allow the drug to block it anymore. In this case, that mutation stopped the drugs from blocking the tumor. So they created a new drug that binds to the protein in a different place. So, and that's where we see other things going. So the question is, we have to figure out why did the drug stop working? Because that's usually the driver mutation continues. Where is the escape mechanism? And then go and add something to block that escape, and eventually probably use that from the beginning to prevent that from happening.
Cigarette manufacturers have traditionally claimed that low-tar filtered cigarettes mitigate the risk for lung cancer. Is there any evidence for that claim?
No.
No. So it's not true, really?
No, it's not true.
Okay.
Yes?
When we're checking for molecular markers, is that in the tumor cell or in the person's genome?
Oh, that's a great question. So the question is, when we're looking for molecular markers, are we looking for them in the person or in the tumor? So traditionally, we have looked for the mutations in the tumor. The person was not born with the mutation, so the normal cells of that person will not have those mutations. They occurred as the cancer was developing. However, what scientists found, again, a few years ago, is that you will find, if you look for it, you will find tumor cells and tumor, even free DNA of the cells circulating in the body. So today, we have commercial assays that will look for those mutations in the blood. So for example, if you have a patient with the EGFR mutation and the drug stopped working, instead of biopsying again, we can do the blood test and see if you find that T790M mutation. And if you do, then you can use the drug. However, only 25% of patients that have the mutation in the tumor will have the DNA circulating in the blood. So if you don't find it, you still have to go back and you have to biopsy again, because that's something that mutated since your original biopsy. So that's what they call liquid biopsy. Liquid biopsy, you may hear about it, is basically looking for the presence of tumor cells or the DNA of the tumor in the blood. But again, you may find it or not. If you find it, you can use it. PD-1, for example, is we can't use it, even if we find it, because again, it's not specific necessarily to the tumor, but also because the way that the drugs were approved for the 50%, you need to specifically have that in the tumor. You cannot use the blood.
Can lung cancer in smokers also spread to the pancreas?
So the question is, can lung cancer in smokers spread to the pancreas? So the most common sites of spread of lung cancer once it's spread is bones, brain, liver. But it can, and of course besides the lymph nodes, but it can spread to any organ.
In an area with a high carbon monoxide environment outdoors, where around a lot of cars running, running rich and where they pollute and put a lot of carbon monoxide, how can that affect the person in bringing about lung cancer?
Right. So carbon monoxide by itself is not it's a carcinogen. I mean, it's going to affect the body in different ways. But pollution in general, with all the particulates, so we talk about the suspended particles and the toxins will. But again, it's not clear what that percentage of risk. I mean, it's assumed that we have all this junk in the air, it's going to affect you. But the studies have been hard to define, and it's controversial how much it does.
My wife works at a school crossing yard.
Mm-hmm.
She's in an area with heavy carbon monoxide concentration,
Mhm.
especially in the winter where people insist on running their cars. But she's gone through lung cancer, in fact, almost a year ago with a lobectomy.
Right.
And
So it's not necessarily carbon monoxide, but other pollutants certainly could contribute.
Is there any reason why you cannot get radiation again? If they radiate in one spot, why can't they, that is like starting to grow again, why can't they radiate that again?
So the question is, why can't we radiate again if something comes back or grows? The reason is that because of the physics of radiation, you have a lifelong effect on healthy organs. So there is so much radiation that each organ can get before you get what you call necrosis. So even if you got radiation 10 years ago, there is a threshold after which you're going to cause necrosis on that tissue. So it's a lifelong, so each organ has a lifelong maximum amount. And the thing with chemotherapy is, with radiation, when we're treating with radiation, most cancers, many cancers, including lung, you're going to be going close to the maximum total dose. And that's the whole concept that I mentioned of the proton. Because it's not how much a tumor can get, but the healthy tissues around it. And the one that has the lowest, one of the lowest, well, not the lowest, but in terms of side effects, that is a problem, is the spinal cord. So remember when I was showing those designs, that's why proton many times will be an option, because you absolutely cannot let any radiation added, because when you do the plans, many times they maximize the amount of safe radiation you can do to the spinal cord in the corners of your field of radiation. And that's where the proton is used many times when you're re-radiating, because then you're concentrating only on the area of tumor and minimizing any effects to surrounding tissues.
If a person decided to have the CyberKnife or the stereotactic radiation therapy, and you said it has to be a stage 1 cancer or not?
For lung cancer,
For lung cancer.
that's usually the indication, is for small tumors that are not, for whatever reason, they're not going to have surgery.
Okay, so
I'm sorry, the question was CyberKnife and lung
CyberKnife.
cancer, right?
Yeah. So if a person has cyberknife and chooses to do that rather than having surgery and chemotherapy, is that, or those people would never have qualified for chemotherapy, is what you're saying? They never would have been stage 2 people.
In most cases, that's correct. Yes. But again, I'm sorry. Just to the problem, one of the downsides is that you cannot be 100% sure if they were stage 2, because even if the PET scan is negative, many times the surgeons are supposed to go and take the lymph nodes out to be sure of the stage. So you may find small amount of cancer in the lymph nodes that the PET scan didn't catch. So if you're not operating, you cannot even be 100% that it's not stage 2. But if you're doing CyberKnife, you wouldn't do CyberKnife to the tumor plus the whole area of lymph nodes.
As I myself was stage 2 not because it had gone to the lymph glands, but because there was a fuzzy area
Right.
around the small tumor.
Right. And again, there is no free lunch. The CyberKnife, again, is going to develop very high doses of radiation to a limited area. So there is a certain size for which beyond the CyberKnife would not be indicated also, because again, it's a lot of radiation.
It does sound wonderful. And Dr. Gil Liederman's advertisement, it sounds like, whoa, you won't have to put poisonous chemicals into you. This is a good alternative.
Right.
But I see that's what you're saying.
Yeah, if you Google Dr. Liederman, you're going to see all the what the government is after him for, and the George Harrison family
The
too.
George Harrison with the
Right.
guitar.
Yeah, he's a
Yeah,
bizarre guy. Yes. Oh, sorry.
The question was answered.
Recommendation on CT scans for former smokers, how often?
Right. So the screening studies I showed before, the guidelines are, and beyond that, we don't know the benefits, but 55 to 80 with a history of 30 pack years. So 1 pack a day for 30 years or the equivalent. So, and then the study was for 3 years, but routinely we would continue doing that because the risk is always there.
Is there effects from repeated scanning?
Every year.
No, I'm saying repeated effects to the body from the scan.
Yes, absolutely. There is radiation that's the problem. The more radiation you get, the higher the risk. And that's why, again, the age 55 and the low dose radiation. That's the whole idea. It's not as good a CAT scan as a regular scan because it has less radiation. So it's a screening test. But there's definitely, so the older you are, also there's a lesser risk of the radiation because radiation works in many years, the damage happens many years later. So for someone who is in their 20s and get radiation from a lot of imaging studies, or in their teens, their lifetime risk of having cancer related to the radiation is much greater than if you're 6 or 7 in terms of the years that you have to develop something.
A lot of the insurance companies tell you it's not medically necessary.
Well, again, it's very well defined because that's how the study was done, as I mentioned.
But yet Medicare will pay for it in a heartbeat.
Right, they'll pay again if it's indicated within the constraints of how the study was done.
My question was on hereditary factors. Does that?
I'm sorry, what factors?
No, coming through family history,
Mm-hmm.
hereditary, and does it mean that you're predisposed for any type of cancer? Because it could come up in anywhere, not necessarily in the same area that someone in the family had. So it could be affecting different people in the family in different ways.
So the question is the risk for someone with lung cancer, if the family is at risk for any different cancers, and the answer is no. The studies, different cancers have different family risks. For example, prostate cancer patients, first-degree relatives have increased risk of prostate cancer. CLL patients have increased risk of first-degree relatives of CLL. Lung cancer patients of lung cancer. And so it's not all kinds of cancer. So these are all, cancers are different diseases in different parts of the body. Having said that, there are some, again, exceptions to everything. There are some genetic diseases, especially the switch that I mentioned, that switch protein. If you have a mutation in the switch protein in your family, then you will be at risk for many different cancers. But for the majority of these things are very specific to the family member.
the age range, 55 to 80 years old, that means that the older we are, the more chance we come down with it.
Correct. So as we showed in the beginning, lung cancer, as most cancers, is a disease of older people, the majority older than 60. And and again, that's when you have, the older you are, the more, especially on the cigarette smokers, is the more exposure you have to cigarette smoking. So that's how they chose that age group. We have no more questions. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you so much for watching this presentation. I hope that you found it helpful. Remember, the library is here to help you with our Just for the Health of It initiative. Stop by the reference desk anytime or call us at 732-390-6767, and our consumer health librarians are always available to help you.